All right, so we're diving into some pretty fascinating territory today with this whole 2008 financial crisis thing.
Absolutely. And you've really come armed with the research, I can tell. You've been digging deep, wanting to go beyond that typical like housing bubble story.
Exactly. I mean, we've all heard that part, right? But these sources you've shared, they paint a much bigger picture, like a whole web of causes. And honestly, I'm kind of hooked now, ready to untangle this whole mess.
And you've come to the right place for that.
Yeah.
You know, what really struck me going through all of this is how much the idea of incentives keeps popping up. Almost like the whole system was, well, maybe not intentionally, but like rigged to fail.
Okay, yeah, I see that everywhere in these articles too, but what does that even mean in real world terms? Was it just plain old greed, or is there something else going on beneath the surface?
Oh, it's way more complicated than just pointing fingers at greed. This is where Stiglitz's analysis really gets interesting. He makes a strong case that the entire structure of rewards, particularly in finance, played a huge role.
So it's not so much about individual bad apples, but like the whole the whole system, the way it was set up was kind of pushing people in the wrong direction.
Exactly. Think about those huge executive bonuses everyone always talks about,
Right.
right? It wasn't just about showing up and looking important. A lot of it was directly tied to these things called stock options.
Okay, so their bonuses were basically riding on how well the company's stock was doing.
And here's the kicker. Those stock options were often structured in a way that rewarded short-term gains, even if it meant taking on insane risks that could blow up in everyone's faces later on.
So the incentive was basically to pump those stock prices up as high as possible, as quickly as possible, even if it meant the whole house of cards could come crashing down later.
You got it. Long-term stability just wasn't sexy enough. They were being rewarded for flying high and cashing out fast, and the consequences, well, they were someone else's problem.
And that's where those subprime mortgages come in, right? I remember that phrase being thrown around a lot back then. What was the incentive to get mixed up with those?
You're on the right track. You want to understand this thing called regulatory arbitrage. Okay, imagine this. Banks are taking these really risky subprime loans, bundling them together, and get this, getting those big rating agencies, the ones supposed to tell us what's safe, to slap a perfectly safe label on them.
Wait, seriously, how does that even happen?
Well, there were these loopholes in the system. This allowed them to make a ton of money in the short term while offloading the risk onto investors who had no idea what they were really buying. It's like selling someone a ticking time bomb disguised as a clock radio.
That's that's messed up. So everyone's so busy chasing profits that they're ignoring the bigger picture, the systemic risk. But hold on a second. Weren't there all those fancy risk management models in place? You know, we always hear about how banks use algorithms and all this data to assess risk. Surely those should have caught this, right?
That's where things get really interesting. Those models were supposed to be the safety net, the guardians against disaster. But as we found out the hard way, they were deeply, deeply flawed.
What went wrong? Did they just not have enough data? Were they not sophisticated enough?
Well, it's more complicated than that. You were right to bring up those risk models because they turned out to be way off the mark. Remember how we were just talking about incentives and that obsession with short-term gains? Well, those models, they were basically designed with the same blind spots.
Okay, so the very tools that were supposed to protect the system were actually built with the same flawed thinking that was causing the problems in the first place. That's not very reassuring, is it?
Not at all. They were good at assessing the risk of a single loan or a single investment in isolation.
Mm.
But they completely missed the bigger picture, the risk of a domino effect, where one thing going wrong could trigger a chain reaction that brought the whole system crashing down. Stiglitz calls this systemic risk. It's like the difference between looking at a single tree and understanding the health of the entire forest.
So like dominoes, right? One falls, triggers the next, and so on. But these models, they were just looking at each domino in isolation without understanding how they were all connected.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, those models relied on historical data, assuming that the future would basically be a repeat of the past. They were working with this idea of a normal distribution, failing to account for those rare but potentially catastrophic events, what we call tail events.
So like those rare events that no one expects, but when they happen, they really throw a wrench in the works. Like finding out your supposedly 1 in a million lottery ticket was actually a dud all along.
That's a great way to put it. Nelson and Katzenstein, they really dig into this in their paper. They argue that financial markets, they don't always play by the rules of a simple coin flip. Sometimes it's more like flipping a coin that might land on its side, or disappear altogether.
That sounds a little terrifying, to be honest. So everyone's walking around with this false sense of security, thinking these models have got their backs, but they're really just driving blindfolded with one foot on the gas pedal.
And the worst part is that false sense of security, that illusion of control, it actually encouraged even more risk-taking. It's like thinking you have this invincible shield when in reality you're holding up a flimsy piece of cardboard.
This is fascinating, but also pretty terrifying. So we've got perverse incentives, flawed risk models, a system teetering on the brink. What happened next? Did anyone see this train wreck coming and try to stop it? Or were we all just headed for a financial cliff? It's like we're watching this financial train barreling down the tracks, right? Brakes are shot, and everyone's just kind of standing around wondering if anyone's going to, pull the emergency brake. Did anyone even try to intervene before it all went off the rails?
You're right on the money with that analogy. And the frustrating thing is there were warnings. There were definitely red flags waving, but it was like they were drowned out by the sheer momentum of that train, Stiglitz talks about how the regulatory system itself, it was actually part of the problem.
So not just the conductor, but the whole railroad was like designed to ignore those warning signals. That's kind of a scary thought.
Exactly. It was this perfect storm of, well, those bad incentives we talked about, blind faith in those flawed models, and a regulatory system that was, to put it bluntly, asleep at the wheel. And then when that crash finally happened, the policy responses, well, they were, and I put this delicately, a mixed bag, to say the least.
Let's dive into that bag then, shall we? I mean, we all remember those headlines about bank bailouts, stimulus packages, all that. But did it actually work? I mean, did it stop the bleeding?
That, my friend, is the million-dollar question that economists are still wrestling with today. Stiglitz, he acknowledges that those interventions, those big moves like the bailouts, pumping money into the economy, trying to adjust fiscal policy, all of that, it did prevent a complete and utter meltdown. But UT, and this is a big but, he also points out some serious shortcomings. And it looks like you picked up on some of those in your research.
Yeah, I did have a few questions about that. Lay it on me. What were the downsides, the unintended consequences of those interventions? It just seemed like, I don't know, trying to put out a fire with a garden hose.
Well, gotta give them credit. Those bailouts, they did prevent some of those big institutions from going under, those dominoes from falling, but it came at a cost. See, it accidentally created this thing called a moral hazard.
Moral hazard. Sounds kind of ominous. Break it down for me. What's so hazardous about it?
Okay, imagine this. You're at a casino, right? And, your friend, they always get bailed out by, like, their rich uncle if they lose all their money. So are you going to be more likely to lend them money, even if they're being reckless, knowing that someone else will pick up the tab if things go south?
Yeah, I see where you're going with this.
Right.
So these bailouts, they basically sent the message that if you're big enough, important enough, too big to fail, then the government's got your back no matter how recklessly you play the game.
Bingo. It kind of unintentionally rewarded some of the very behavior that led to the crisis in the first place. And then there's the whole debate about the stimulus packages. Were they big enough? Were they targeted at the right areas? It's like, I don't know, trying to water your whole garden with one of those tiny sprinklers. Some plants get what they need, others just kind of wither away.
Sounds like there's no easy answer there, which I guess is why it's still being debated today. But beyond all the technical stuff, the bailouts, the stimulus, all that, what about the human cost? We're talking about real people's lives here, right? Those numbers on a spreadsheet, they represent actual human beings.
You are absolutely right to bring that up. We get so caught up in the financial side of things, the technicalities, it's easy to forget about the very real human beings whose lives were turned upside down. And this is something that Stuckler and his colleagues really hammered home in their research. This wasn't just about numbers. It was about people losing their jobs, their homes, their sense of security, their hope.
It's funny you should say that. I remember reading that statistic about the rise in suicides after the crisis, and it really got to me. You can get so lost in the weeds, the technical jargon, that you forget about the real human cost,
And those weren't just statistics. Those were real people struggling to cope with the fallout, the ripple effects of this massive economic shock. One of the stories that Stuckler tells, and it's heartbreaking, it's about this factory worker who'd been at his job for years, dedicated, reliable, and then, boom, the crisis hits. He loses his job, and this guy who was the provider for his family falls into a deep depression, feels like he's a failure. And his story, sadly, wasn't unique. There were thousands just like him, all across the country, all over the world.
That's a really powerful reminder that these economic shocks, they have these very real, very human consequences. Makes you wonder, is there a way to, I don't know, soften the blow, to create some kind of cushion for everyday people when these kinds of events happen?
You're thinking along the right lines. Stuckler and his team, they make a really compelling case for robust social safety nets, and it seems like that resonated with you as well, reading through the research.
It did. It makes sense, right? If you know there's something to catch you, you're less likely to fall apart when things go wrong.
Exactly. And they point to Austria as a really interesting case study. Now, Austria, they got hit by the crisis, just like everyone else, but despite that, they actually saw a decline in suicide rates.
Wait, a decline in the middle of a financial crisis? How is that even possible?
That's the power of a well-designed social safety net. They already had these strong social support systems in place, things like unemployment benefits, that weren't just a temporary Band-Aid, but provided a real cushion, a sense of security when people lost their footing.
So it's like having shock absorbers for society. When that earthquake hits, those safety nets, they help distribute the impact, prevent total collapse. That's actually pretty hopeful when you think about it that way.
It's about creating a society that values its members, even when times are tough.
Yeah.
A society that recognizes that everyone needs a little help sometimes, that we're all in this together. And it's not just about handouts. It's about investing in people, in their well-being, so they can bounce back stronger. But we've been talking about this crisis on a national level, but you're right, this was a global event. Where does the rest of the world fit into this whole story? Was this just a uniquely American thing, or was there something bigger going on?
Yeah, I was wondering about that too. It feels like we've been so focused on what happened here, we haven't really zoomed out to look at the bigger picture, the global context. And that's where Robinson's work really comes in, right? This whole idea of globalization and the rise of what did he call it, a transnational capitalist class. Those are some pretty big terms.
Yeah, definitely. And they're crucial for understanding how this crisis went global. He argues that these forces, these interconnected networks of power and influence, played a huge role in setting the stage for the crisis, creating the conditions that made it possible.
Okay, so like while we're all focused on these individual actors, these banks and borrowers, there's this whole other level, this global system that's influencing everything. It's like there's a whole other game being played on a bigger chessboard.
Exactly. And those players on that global chessboard, they have different priorities, different incentives. Robinson argues that globalization, the increasing interconnectedness of economies, it's led to a concentration of wealth and power in the hands of this transnational capitalist class. They have interests that span borders, and those interests don't always align with the interests of everyday people or even individual nations.
So like one country's economic hiccup can quickly turn into a global pandemic, so to speak, just because of how interconnected everything is.
That's a great way to put it. It highlights the fragility of the system and how events in one corner of the world can reverberate throughout the entire global economy. And it raises some really important questions about who benefits from this system and who bears the brunt of the costs when things go wrong. It's like we've peeled back all these layers of an onion, and with each layer, there's a whole new set of complexities.
And maybe shed a few tears along the way. All this talk about economic meltdowns and global power struggles, it's a bit heavy. But hey, that's what we signed up for with these deep dives, right? To go beyond the headlines and really grapple with the bigger picture, even if it gets a little uncomfortable.
You said it. It's about connecting the dots, seeing how all these seemingly separate pieces fit together. And speaking of connecting dots, you had some really interesting questions about the whole corporate governance angle. What were your initial thoughts on that?
Yeah, when I hear corporate governance, I think of like checks and balances, ethical behavior, making sure everyone's playing by the rules. But did that really play a role in this whole mess, or was it more of a side story?
Oh, it's definitely not a side story. Erkins and his team, they did some fascinating research on this, looking at financial institutions all over the world. And what they found was, well, it might surprise you. It turns out that the firms with more independent boards, the ones that are supposed to be less influenced by those short-term pressures and a higher percentage of institutional ownership, they actually experienced worse stock returns during the crisis.
Wait, seriously, that seems counterintuitive. I think those are considered like good governance practices,
Yeah.
right? More independent voices, a broader range of stakeholders. Shouldn't that lead to better decisions, better risk management, and ultimately better performance?
That's what you'd think, right? But their research throws a bit of a curveball. It suggests that in the years leading up to the crisis, those independent boards and those institutional investors, they might have actually pushed for more risk-taking, not less.
So even with all the safeguards in place, the allure of those short-term gains was just too strong to resist. Everyone was so caught up in the moment, they couldn't see the bigger picture.
It seems that way. Remember those perverse incentives we talked about? Well, it turns out those incentives can have a ripple effect, even influencing the decisions made in the name of good governance. Those shareholders, as diverse as they might be, they all had one thing in common.
Yeah.
They wanted to see those returns, and they wanted them fast.
So it's like everyone's playing this high-stakes game thinking they've got the winning strategy, but they're not all playing by the same rules. And then the music stops, and it's a mad scramble for the exits.
That's a perfect analogy.
Hmm.
And when the music stopped in 2008, the whole system just seized up. Those rule books, they were written for a different time, a simpler time. They were woefully inadequate for the kind of complex, interconnected global economy that we had created.
Wow, this deep dive has been quite a ride. We've gone from dissecting those financial instruments to uncovering the global forces that shape our world. It's a lot to process.
And let's not forget all the insights you've brought to the table. Your observations about the human cost, the stories of those who are struggling to make ends meet to keep their heads above water. It adds a whole other dimension to our understanding of this crisis.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the numbers, the jargon, but we can't forget that these events, they have a real impact on real people's lives. It makes you wonder, what's the point of a system that can't protect its most vulnerable members when things go wrong?
That's a question we should all be asking ourselves. And maybe that's the most important takeaway from our deep dive today. The need to constantly question our assumptions, to challenge the status quo, to never stop seeking a deeper understanding of the systems that shape our world.
Before we started this whole deep dive, I thought I had a pretty decent handle on the 2008 financial crisis. But now I realize I was just scratching the surface. It's like I was looking at a postcard when what I really needed was to immerse myself in a 360-degree panorama.
And that's the beauty of learning, isn't it? We often start with a single question, a spark of curiosity, and it leads us down this rabbit hole of interconnected ideas, new perspectives.
Speaking of new perspectives, do you have any final words of wisdom for our listeners before we wrap up this investigation? What's the one thing you hope they'll take away from our conversation today?
If there's one thing I hope our listeners remember, it's this. We're not just passive passengers on this wild ride we call the global economy. We have a voice, we have agency, and we have the power to shape a better future. Knowledge is power, and this deep dive has equipped you with a deeper understanding of how this complex system works. So what will you do with that knowledge? That's the question I want you to ponder.
That's a powerful note to end on. It reminds me of that famous quote, "The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing." The more we learn, the more we realize how much more there is to discover.
Absolutely.
Very.
Keep asking questions, keep seeking knowledge, and keep challenging the status quo. The world needs more curious minds like yours, willing to dive deep and explore these complex issues.
Well said. It's been a pleasure diving into these fascinating sources with you. Until next time, keep those brain cells buzzing. And remember, the world is your oyster, just waiting to be explored.